Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren,
Ladies and
und liebe
gentlemen,
Gäste, vor
dear
10 Jahren
guests,
starb viel zu früh
the
der
publicist
Publizist Frank
Frank Schirmacher died 10 years ago,
viele
far too
Gründe,
young.
an ihn zu erinnern,
I would
aber
like
auch, weil in
us
seinen
to
letzten
remember him
Lebensjahren
today. There are many
kaum
reasons
ein
to
anderer,
remember
erinnere
him,
ich
but
mich,
because in the
Deutschland
last
eine
years of his
brennende
life,
Frage gestellt
he
hat,
was
die
among the
Frage
few
nämlich,
in
die uns
Germany
nicht
to ask the
loslässt.
burning question
Hat
that
die
still
Zeit des
hangs over us
technologischen
now.
Totalitarismus,
Has
so
the
hat er es
age of
genannt,
technological
hat diese Zeit
totalitarianism
der die Macht der
begun,
Maschine,
as he called it, an age
digitale
in which
Maschine
the
den
might of
Menschen
the
in neuer,
machine, the digital
nie
machine,
gekannter Weise
will
entwürdigen kann.
disempower the human being in a new and
Mobil bietet diese
unprecedented
neue
way.
Kommunikationstechnik
This communications
zweifellos
technology
reizvolle
offers
Angebote des
attractive
Austausches, der
opportunities to
Vernetzung,
connect,
der
to share, to find
Informationsbeschaffung, der
information,
individuellen
to express
Selbstdarstellung,
our individuality.
unterhalb der
Below the
Benutzeroberfläche sammelt
user's
und
interface,
kommerzialisiert sie
however,
persönlich
it
Daten
collects and commercializes
unvorstellbarem
personal
Ausmaß,
data on an
beutet sie
unimaginable
gegen den
scale
arglosen Nutzer
and
gewendet
turns
für
them
Konsum
against
und
the
Kontrolle,
unsuspecting
auch für
user,
Manipulation und
exploiting them for
Überwachung.
consumerism and control, for manipulation
Technologischer
and surveillance.
Totalitarismus hieß auch der
Technological
dank 2015
totalitarianism was
Frank
also the name
Schirmachers
of the
posthumen
volume edited
Herausgeberschaft
by
veröffentlichte
Frank
Band
Schirmacher and
Viele der
posthumously published in
Autorinnen und Autoren
2015,
brachte zum ersten
which
Mal damals
introduced many of the
in die
featured
deutsche
authors to the
Öffentlichkeit.
German
Evgeny
public for
Morozov,
the first time.
Shoshana Zuboff,
Yevgeny
Jaron
Morozov,
Lanier.
Shoshana Zuboff,
Alle
and
sie schrieben
Jaron
über
Lanier,
digitales
all of
Wunschdenken,
them
über
wrote respectively about digital
Schürfrechte am
thinking
Leben,
as
Daten, die
wishful
unser Schicksal
thinking,
bestimmen
about
und so
reality
weiter und so
mining, and
weiter.
about
Das
data
Buch
ownership
damals, 10 Jahre alt,
will
sollte
determine our
aufklären,
fate. The
aufrütteln und die
book was
politischen
intended to
Kräfte
make people sit
von
up and take
Rechtsstaat und
notice and
Demokratie
to
gegen
rouse the
digitale
political forces
Überwältigung
of the
des
rule of
Menschen
law and democracy
wecken.
against the digital overwhelming
Wir
of the
wollen heute
human
fragen,
being.
wo wir 10 Jahre später stehen.
I ask myself
Auch
where we
fragen,
stand
warum
10 years
Digitalisierung
on,
einerseits in aller Munde
why
ist, warum wir aber
digitalization is on the
auf
one
die
hand on
Risiken
everyone's
von
lips, but
digitaler
why we have
Manipulation
relatively few
vergleichsweise
responses
wenige
to the
Antworten.
risks of digital
Und ja,
manipulation.
auch das stimmt.
And yes, and this is true as
Viele
well,
Nutzer
many
unempfindlich dem
users
Thema
seem to have become
gegenüber geworden zu
insensitive
sein.
to the issue.
Digitale Enthusiasten
Although
dagegen
digital
reagieren schon
enthusiasts
empfindlich auf die
react
Frage nach
sensitively
Risiken.
when even
Der
the
Grund
question
scheint
of
auf der Hand
risks
zu
is
liegen. Die
asked.
Attraktivität
The
des
reason seems
Digitalen,
obvious,
mehr
the
noch die
attractiveness of the
Unverzichtbarkeit,
digital
die
world,
Allgegenwart
indeed
der
its
Anwendungen in immer mehr
indispensability,
Bereichen
the
unseres Lebens
ubiquity of its applications
ist
in more and
einfach
more areas of our
überwältigend.
lives is
Sie ist zu einer
simply overwhelming.
Kulturtechnik des modernen
It has
Menschen
become a
geworden,
foundational element
eine
of our modern
Kulturtechnik, die
civilization,
uns inzwischen
something
auch definiert.
that defines
Segen
us
für die einen,
as a human being.
Fluch für andere,
A blessing for some,
aber
a curse
Alltag
for
für uns
others.
alle.
Everyday
Und
life,
doch wäre
however,
es
for
zynisch zu
everyone.
sagen, dass sich
And yet
Schirmachers
it would be
Frage damit
cynical
erübrigt
to
hat.
say that
Demokratinnen und
Schirmacher's
Demokraten
question is no longer
müssen
relevant
sich mit
as
ihr
a result.
auseinandersetzen.
All Democrats
Deshalb
must
wollen wir sie
grapple
heute
with
neu
it.
stellen, die Frage nach
Today,
dem öffentlichen Raum
this is why we want to
im
ask this
digitalen
question anew, the question of the
Maschinenzeitalter, die
public
Frage
sphere in the digital
nach dem
machine
ethischen
age, the
Minimum,
question of the
das uns
ethical
leiten
minimum
muss und
that
soll.
must and should guide
Wobei,
us.
daran erinnern wir uns,
However,
die kluge Maschine.
the
Die kluge Maschine
smart
ist ein Topos, der
machine,
schon
let's recall
Jahrhunderte
that,
lang
is a trope that has haunted
durch die
utopian or
utopische oder
dystopian
dystopische
literature
Literatur
for
geistert.
centuries.
Der Unterschied ist, sie
Now
scheint
it
Realität
seems
zu sein
to have
oder
become, or
zumindest
at
zu
least
sein. Denn
to becoming a reality. That's the
Datendepots
difference
sind
here.
jetzt schon
The heaps of data are
groß geworden,
now
die digitale
large enough.
Rechenleistung für
The
ihre
digital
blitzschnelle
computing
Verwertung
power for
ist
processing
so
these data
gewaltig,
is at
dass
lightning
unsere
speed, is
Computer
so
Vorhersagen
vast
treffen,
that our computers can make
Sprachen
predictions,
übersetzen,
translate
Wissensfragen nicht nur
languages,
beantworten,
not
sondern
only answer requests for
sie alle in
information,
Essayform
but
ausspucken,
churn out full
Stimmen
essays,
nachahmen,
imitate
Gedichte schreiben,
voices,
Fotos
write
imitieren,
poems, photos,
Gemälde alter
imitate
Meister und
photos or the
vieles andere
paintings
mehr.
of old masters,
Was
and
ist der
much
Nutzen?
more.
Wo liegen
What
die
is the
Risiken
benefit
für
and
Freiheit
where
und
are the
Demokratie?
risks
Darüber
to
wollen wir heute
freedom and
sprechen.
democracy? This is
In
what we
einer
want to discuss
Gesprächsreihe,
today
der
in
eine
a
oder
series
andere,
of
der uns
talks.
folgt, weiß das, die den großen Wandel
Many following
Blick
us
nimmt.
will
Wir
know
haben
that.
hier über
Many
die
talks that explore the
Loslösung
great
von
transformation
fossilen
that our
Energieträgern
societies
mehrere
have
Male
begun,
miteinander
above all the
gesprochen.
shift away from
Jetzt über die
fossil
Entwicklung
fuels, and now
der digitalen
the
Schlüsseltechnologie in
development
der
of the
Zukunft.
key digital
Ich
technologies of the
begrüße Sie alle sehr
future.
herzlich hier im
I
Schloss
bid you
Bellevue
all
und
a very
bevor wir in
warm
die
welcome to
Diskussion
Schloss
einsteigen, möchte
Bellevue,
ich
and
gerne
before we begin our
über drei aus
discussion,
meiner Sicht
I would like to
zentrale
talk
Dinge
about
reden, die
three
es
things
braucht,
that I believe are crucial
wenn es um
when it
KI
comes
und
to
ihre
AI
Möglichkeiten
and
geht.
its possibilities.
Verständnis, Verantwortung
Understanding, responsibility,
und am Ende geht es
and
nicht ohne
in the
Vertrauen.
end, trust.
Die Erfindung des
Dear
Internets wird
guests,
immer wieder
the invention of the Internet
mit der
is
Erfindung des
regularly
Buchdrucks verglichen.
compared with the invention of the
Buchdruck, der
printing
damals die
press.
Welt
The advent of printing
revolutionierte.
revolutionized the world.
Schriften konnten vervielfacht
Texts
werden.
could be reproduced in
Richtig, auch
large
religiöse und
quantities,
politische
including
Streitschriften.
religious
Informationen
and
und
political
Überzeugungen ließen sich
pamphlets.
schnell und zum ersten
Information
Mal
as
weit
well as
verbreiten.
convictions could
Die
rapidly
Reformation
spread
ist
far
ohne
and
den
wide.
Buchdruck so wenig denkbar
The Reformation would have been
wahrscheinlich die Idee der
inconceivable without the
Demokratie, die
printing
eine
press, and so would the idea of
weitgehende
democracy, which
Alphabetisierung und öffentlichen
requires
Meinungsstreit unter
widespread
Informierten
literacy and public
bekanntlich
clashes of
voraussetzt.
opinion between informed
Gutenberg hat mit seiner
individuals.
Erfindung die Grundlage für die
Gutenberg's
Moderne
invention
geschaffen.
laid the foundation for the
Er
modern era,
verfolgte wahrscheinlich
when
doch einfach
probably
eine
in fact he had
Geschäftsidee,
merely
nämlich den massenhaften
been
Vertrieb
pursuing a business idea, the sale of large quantities of
Beispiel
German
Gutenbergs
language
zeigt,
Bibles.
bei
This
jeder
example,
Erfindung
the example of Gutenberg, shows that
kann es
every invention
beabsichtigte und
can have
unbeabsichtigte Nebeneffekte geben.
unintended
Nicht immer
side
ist es
effects.
gleich eine
These are not always
Medienrevolution, aber
necessarily a media
die sozialen und
revolution,
politischen Folgen zu
but
verstehen,
understanding the social
die
and political
Grundlage
consequences is
technische
essential
Neuerungen
in order to be
angemessen
able to appropriately
verantwortungsvoll
and responsibly
weiterentwickeln
develop and use
und am Ende
technological
Eine
innovations.
Technologie zu verstehen heißt auch,
Understanding a technology
möglichst
also
darauf
means
vorbereitet zu sein,
being
auf unterschiedlichste Möglichkeiten.
prepared for it to be used in many
Wir
different
sollten uns
ways.
besser
And
vorbereiten,
we
denn
should
wir
in
können
fact
einmal
be better
Erfundenes
prepared, because once
nicht
something
ignorieren
has been invented,
und nur
we
selten
cannot ignore
rückgängig
it, and
Es
in
geht
only rare
inzwischen,
cases are able to undo it.
das wissen Sie, längst nicht mehr um die
For a long
Frage,
time now, the
ob die
crucial
KI
question
weiter
has not
Einfluss
been
auf
whether
unser Leben
AI
nehmen
will
wird.
continue to influence our
Nicht das
lives,
Ob ist entscheidend,
not
sondern das
whether,
Wie.
but how
Und ich bin
actually is
überzeugt,
crucial.
bleibe überzeugt, wir sind
I'm
dieser
convinced,
technischen
I
Entwicklung
remain
nicht einfach
convinced,
nur
we're not
ausgeliefert.
powerless in the face
Aber
of
ich bin ebenso
technological
überzeugt, wir
development,
müssen
but
sie
I'm
wir
also
müssen
convinced
sie
we
verstehen,
must understand
sie
it
gestalten
in
zu
order
können.
to be able to shape it.
Liebe Gäste, der
Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests,
Weltrisiko-
the latest global
gibt
risks report, yes, there is such a
er zeichnete im
thing,
Januar dieses Jahres
painted
ein auf den ersten Blick
a
etwas düsteres Bild. Als
rather
große
gloomy
Gefahr
picture at first
bewerteten die
glance
Analysten des
when it
World
was
Economic
released this
Forums
January.
große Gefahr.
The analysts from the World
KI-generierte Fake
Economic
News,
Forum assessed the
Cyberangriffe,
greatest risk to be
Desinformation.
AI-generated fake news, cyber
Das fand ich
attacks, and
deshalb düster,
disinformation.
weil das
I
rangiert
call this
in der
gloomy
Beschreibung der
because
Analysten noch vor anderen
it
Gefahren wie
ranks
Extremwetter,
ahead of
erleben wir
other
gleich noch,
dangers, such as
gesellschaftliche
extreme weather,
Polarisierung
societal polarization,
erstaunlicherweise noch
and
vor bewaffneten
surprisingly
Konflikten.
also ahead of armed
Aber, und auch
conflict.
das sei gesagt,
But, and let
das,
me
was dort
also
steht in diesem
say this very
Risikobericht,
clearly,
das ist mitnichten eine
this
Zukunftsvorhersage.
by no
Denn wie
means
groß die Gefahr
predicts
für
the
unsere
future,
Demokratien durch künstliche Intelligenz tatsächlich ist, haben
because
Regierungen,
governments,
Unternehmen
businesses, and
Gesellschaften
societies
natürlich in der Hand.
themselves have the means to
Und
determine
gerade
how
im
great the
300.
risks
Geburtsjahr Immanuel
that
Kants müssen wir
artificial
uns fragen,
intelligence
was können
poses to
wir
our
tun,
democracies really is.
unsere
Now,
digitale
as we mark the
Mündigkeit
300th
zu
anniversary
erhalten
of
und
Immanuel
Verständnis,
Kant's birth, no less we must
Verständigung,
ask ourselves, what can we do in order to remain
Partizipation
digitally
zu
empowered,
fördern.
to foster
Wenn
understanding
Bürgerinnen
and
und Bürger zu
communication,
Lieferanten von
active
Datensätzen
engagement
werden
and
und sich von solchen
participation? When
Technologien
citizens, individuals become
Geschäftsmodellen,
suppliers of
Inhalten
data sets
abhängig
and
machen
develop a dependencies
von
on
solchen Modellen, die
technologies,
sie nicht
business
richtig
models and
verstehen, dann
content that they don't
steht
really
das eigentlich der
understand,
Idee der
this
Aufklärung entgegen.
runs contrary to the idea of the
Medienbildung,
Enlightenment.
mit anderen Worten,
Learning to
ist auch
engage with
Demokratiebildung.
media, in other words, also
Wir müssen
means learning to
gemeinsames
engage with
Verständnis über die
democracy.
KI
We must
entwickeln und wir müssen
develop a
unsere
shared
Urteilskraft
understanding of
stärken, Menschen
AI. We
befähigen,
must hone
auf der
our
Grundlage
judgment.
von
We must give people the skills to
verifizierbaren
critically
Fakten
examine sources on the
Quellen
basis
kritisch
of
zu hinterfragen,
verifiable facts in order to avoid
möglichst Fehlurteile
drawing
oder die
false
meisten davon zu vermeiden.
conclusions and
Es
question
braucht mit
sources.
anderen Worten
We, in other words,
sowohl erweiterte
words
Medienkompetenz
need both
als auch
greater media
verbesserten
literacy
Schutz vor Missbrauch.
and protection against
Das bringt mich
abuse.
zu einem zweiten Punkt.
That
Der
brings me to
zweite
a
Punkt
second
ist
point,
überschrieben mit Verantwortung.
responsibility.
Der Aufstieg des radikalen
The
Populismus,
rise of radical populism in Europe,
russische
Russian disinformation
Desinformationskampagnen
campaigns,
und der chinesische
and the Chinese
Überwachungsstaat,
surveillance
all diese
state,
Entwicklungen
all
sind
of
aufs
these
engste
developments
verknüpft
are intimately
mit
linked
dem Wandel unseres
to the transformation of our
Kommunikationsökosystems.
communications
Der
ecosystems.
Einführung von
The launch of ChatGPT at the end of 2022 opened up entirely new questions for our political public spheres, our democratic public
Unsere
spheres.
Zukunft hängt von diesen
Our
Technologien
future
ab
both depends on these
und
technologies
ist
and at
gleichzeitig
the
durch
same
sie
time
gefährdet.
is
Nicht mein
imperiled
Satz,
by
sondern so
them.
beschreibt es der
This
britische
is not
Unternehmer
my
und
quote, but this is how the
KI-Experte
AI
Mustafa
expert and entrepreneur
in seinem Buch
Mustafa
The Coming
Suleiman
Wave.
describes this
Wer
in his
entscheidet
book,
also?
The Coming Wave.
Wer entscheidet also, wie
Who
unsere
then
Zukunft
decides
aussieht?
what our
Tech-Riesen,
future will look like?
Startups,
Tech giants or startups? Markets?
autoritäre Regime,
Authoritarian
demokratische Gesellschaften?
regimes, democratic
Wo
societies?
jedenfalls unsere Öffentlichkeiten von
When
autokratischen
our public
Systemen
spheres are
unterwandert werden,
infiltrated by
soll die
autocratic
Demokratie
systems,
mit dem Gift des
the aim
Misstrauens
is
zersetzt
to
werden.
corrode democracy
Es sind
with the
Versuche,
poison
Meinungs-
of
und Willensbildung,
mistrust.
aber auch Wahlen in
These are
liberalen
attempts
Demokratien
to
zu
disrupt the
stören
process of forming
damit die
opinions and
Demokratie
political will, of holding elections
an sich
in
zu
liberal democracy,
diskreditieren und zu delegitimieren.
democracies, and thus
Wir
to
brauchen dringend
discredit and
gemeinsame europäische
delegitimize democracy
Antworten,
itself.
unsere
We
Demokratien,
urgently
unsere Bürgerinnen und
need
Bürger zu
joint
schützen,
European responses in order to
Ja,
protect our democracies and our
sie als
citizens,
selbstbestimmte
indeed,
Bürger frei in
to
der Entscheidung und
uphold
politisch
their status as
handlungsfähig
empowered citizens with
in ihr Recht
political
zu setzen.
agency and the
Und gegen die
freedom
Technologie
to
der
make their own
Entmündigung
decisions.
müssen wir
And
setzen die Handlungsmacht der Mündigen.
also to counter the
Ich bin
technology's
überzeugt, dass wir die
disempowerment with
besten
the
Voraussetzungen
agency
dafür
of the
haben.
empowered.
Ich will das
I
nicht
firmly
übertreiben, aber
believe that we
Deutschland
are
gehört
perfectly
inzwischen,
placed to
was die
do so. I
KI-Forschung
don't want to
angeht,
exaggerate, but Germany
doch in die
is
weltweite Spitze,
among a
zieht
handful of
inzwischen
world
auch,
leaders
wie
in
ich
AI
bei jüngsten Besuchen
research,
erfahren
and
habe,
as
jede
I
Menge
have learned
exzellente
during recent
Wissenschaftlerinnen und
visits, it
Wissenschaftler
attracts
aus der
excellent
ganzen Welt an, hier
scientists
nach
from
Deutschland.
elsewhere to come to
Aber ich
Germany.
glaube,
But
auch
I
das
also
stimmt, wir
believe,
müssen
and
in
this is
unserem
true as
Land
well,
noch besser
our
darin
country
werden,
must become even better
auch das ökonomische
at
Umfeld
also
zu schaffen, um
creating the
Innovationen
right
von der
economic
Grundlagenforschung
environment
bis zur
to bring
Marktreife zu
innovations
führen.
from basic research
Das
to
gehört auch
market
dazu,
readiness.
politische Eliten,
And this is also
Verwaltung
part
auf
and
den
parcel
jeweils neuesten
also
Stand
of
der
this, at
technologischen
ensuring the
Entwicklung zu bringen.
political elites
Kurzum,
and administration
naive
that
Ablehnung
these
wäre
actors
ebenso
are up to
unklug
date with the latest
wie kluge
technological
Nachahmung.
developments. In a
Stattdessen
short,
braucht es
naive
Neugier,
rejection would be just
Forschung
as
und Entwicklung,
unwise as simple
Beschleunigung in der Anwendung
imitation.
und
What we need instead is
Innovationsehrgeiz in
curiosity,
Unternehmen
research and development,
und öffentlichen
accelerated
Verwaltung.
application, ambitious
Noch haben wir die
innovation in
Chance, den
businesses and
Rahmen für
public
KI so zu
administrations.
gestalten, dass sie dem
And we
Menschen
still have the opportunity to
Gemeinwohl
set out a framework
gleichzeitig.
for AI that benefits
Wenn wir
human
das
beings and
erfolgreich
the
tun,
common
das
good.
unterstelle ich für eine
If we
Weile,
succeed in
dann
doing
werden wir
so,
weltweit Standards setzen können und
we
das
will be able
Vertrauen
to
in
set
solche
standards
Technologien
worldwide
vielleicht sogar
and thus
stärken können.
bolster
Es
trust
wäre
in
jedenfalls
new
nicht das erste
technologies.
Mal.
It
Der
would not be the
AI
first
Act der
time
Europäischen Union
with
ist nicht
the
nur
European
umfangreich.
Union's AI
Wir, und
Act.
wenn ich sage wir, meine ich
We not
Europa,
only, we,
haben
and
hier
I
auch
mean
sehr schnell
Europe, not
Verantwortung
only
übernommen und
adopted
deutlich
a
gemacht,
comprehensive piece of
was uns
legislation, we
wichtig
also
ist und
very
vor allen
quickly
Dingen
took
deutlich gemacht,
responsibility and made it
wir
clear
drücken die
what's
sich
important to
aufdrängenden
us.
Fragen nicht
We
einfach weg.
do not shy
Wir
away
geben
from
Antworten,
urgent
die nicht endgültig
questions.
sind,
We look for
aber
answers
wir
together,
zeigen zumindest die Richtung an,
which are not definite
in welcher
answers, but
Zukunft wir leben
we
wollen, und
want
zeigen
to
damit
shed
auch,
light of the question
es
of
ist
what
ein Feld,
future
für
we
das
want
wir
to live
Regeln
in.
brauchen. Und
We
ich bin überzeugt,
need
Made in
rules
Europe
here,
kann
and I
zukünftig ein
firmly believe that
Qualitätssiegel
Made
sein,
in
ein
Europe
Weg
can become a
jenseits
seal
von
of quality, a path
purem
away from
Datenkapitalismus auf der einen
unmitigated
Seite
data
und
capitalism
autokratischer
on the one
Überwachung
hand
auf der
and
anderen Seite.
autocratic surveillance on the other.
Mein letztes Stichwort, liebe Gäste,
I will
Vertrauen.
now come to my final point. Trust.
Desinformation und Fake News sind keine
Disinformation and
neuen
fake
Phänomene,
news are not new phenomena,
verstärken sich aber durch
but they
KI
are
massiv. Je
exploding
mehr
as a result
journalistische
of
Arbeit,
AI.
je mehr
The more
wissenschaftliche
that
Erkenntnisse in
journalists'
Frage
work and
gestellt werden,
scientists' findings
desto
are called
schwieriger
into
wird ein
question, the harder
konstruktiver
it becomes
und vor
to
allen
have a
Dingen
constructive
vernunftbasierter
and rational
Diskurs.
discussion.
Keine Frage, wer
What's clear,
Instabilität
no question
säen
about
will,
that, is that those who want
der
to
hat's eben
sow
im Zeitalter
instability
von KI
will find it
wesentlich leichter.
even easier in the age
In einem
of
solchen
AI.
Kommunikationsumfeld wird nicht
In
nur der
this
unabhängige,
communicative
professionelle und
environment,
seriöse
not only
Journalismus
does
noch wichtiger,
independent,
mehr
professional
noch,
and serious journalism
eigentlich
become
brauchen
even
wir
more
so
important.
etwas wie
No,
ein
more than that,
Herkunftssiegel
we also need
für
something like a
Information.
seal of origin for
Es
information.
gibt Vorschläge, die meisten wissen das hier im
There are
Raum,
already
wie
proposals,
wir
and
eine
most of
alternative
you will know that, for how we could create an alternative infrastructure to global platforms owned by private companies. For example, with a shared European media platform organized as a public service entity that makes us less dependent on other or Chinese algorithms. Whether that is realistic, whether such a platform is realistic, is something that our panel members today will have an opinion on. The idea certainly is already more than a decade old. We already talked about this. So skepticism and doubts are justified, but it's not just about one single European platform, but whether these visions for curbing dangers to democracy and cohesion. What's clear is that the public must be able to trust the law and the rule of law. And so we should, and I'm firmly convinced of this, we should continue to advance political initiatives in the field of AI and, in particular, work together to set positive goals on European level, to develop ethical guidelines for the development of AI and for its various possible applications in order to bolster trust. Democratic societies urgently need to think about how they want to and will be able to continue realizing their freedom, their democratic convictions in an increasingly digital future. Maria Ressa, whom I have the privilege of welcoming here and whom I will introduce in just a moment, has already shared her formula for doing so. And she says, in the long term, the most important thing is education. In the medium term, it's legislation. To restore the rule of law in the virtual world. In the short term, she says, now it's just us. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. And that begins with trust. This is the end of quote of Maria Ressa. Understanding, responsibility and trust. Neither software developers, nor governments, nor digital civil societies will be able to solve the challenges that we face alone. You all know this. No one will be able to find solutions on their own. We need shared goals, a shared movement, if possible, a European movement at least, and we need to be clear. It's about this. This is a task for an entire generation. The author Sascha Lober, you will know him, recently summarized it as thus. The bad sides of AI come together of their own accord. The good ones require us to work hard for them together. And so it is a particular delight to see how many different people are here today for a discussion. You represent politics, business, civil society. I bid you a warm welcome once again to Schloss Bellevue, and I appeal to all of you to take part in our debate, which will follow. Please take part. I look forward to hearing your experiences, your thoughts and ideas for the future. And now, I have the pleasure of welcoming our two panel members. Maria Ressa, you will know her, is a Filipina journalist and author. She predominantly grew up in the US before returning to her home country and having worked in senior positions for major broadcasters there, including CNN, and as I read also later on, the Filipino TV and online network ABS-CBN. And first and foremost, she's famous and known beyond her border. She founded, together with a colleague in 2011, Rappler, a digital news portal. She founded it together with a colleague. They regularly publish critical coverage in difficult times, including of then-President Rodrigo Duterte. As the head of Rappler, Maria Ressa was subjected to a great deal of harassment and pressure by the state. She has shown how bold and courageous journalism can arm itself with the tools of the digital age and, through tenacious effort, open up an alternative public sphere and thus hold those in power accountable. She has won numerous awards, including the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize. Meredith Whittaker is president of the Signal Foundation and thus represents a messaging service that enables genuinely private digital communication thanks to its end-to-end encryption, and that does not compromise, as I read, on protecting privacy. She is an AI expert, an informed critic who has changed her perspective more than once. Even when she worked for Google, she persistently also voiced criticism in public as well and campaigned against surveillance. After leaving the company, she founded the AI Now Institute at NYU in order to explore, in particular, the repercussions of AI. And she has consistently advanced the cause of data protection in her role as a consultant for governments, the European Parliament, and other institutions. Furthermore, I'd also like to welcome Helena Bobrovsky. She's a journalist. Many of you will know her, and she's Deputy Editor-in-Chief at the Startup Table Media, and she will be moderating our event today. I'd like to express also gratitude and thank the Zeit Foundation helping us host such events with the participation of international panelists, and thank you so much. And now allow me to invite all three of you onto the stage. Allow me to invite the three of you onto the stage. I'm very much excited to have you here. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us. I look forward to our discussion.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Now, digital public sphere, do we need a new enlightenment? That's what we want to be talking about today.
No, don't worry. So right now I'm doing this. Digital public, do we need...
So let me repeat that. The digital public sphere, do we need a new enlightenment?
Elucidation, maybe that's the better word. This is what we want to discuss today. I have two fascinating women on my left and on my right side. I'm very much looking forward to discuss this with you and with you, mit Ihnen. Der Bundespräsident hat es gerade schon gesagt, im zweiten Teil.
Now, as we've just heard from the federal president, we want to talk about these issues. We want to hear your questions, your comments, your insights on these matters. So it is an issue that impacts all of us. I think that's become very clear, and it is very much relevant for strengthening and maintaining democracy.
I want to start with your personal approach on the topic of whether AI, artificial intelligence, is a threat or is maybe a chance. And please, Meredith Whittaker, why don't you start telling us your history with AI? How did you get into this, and what is your experience?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for hosting this important discussion and for welcoming us to this debate at this moment. I think there's a lot of ways to approach that question, but the simplest answer is simply that I joined Google out of college in 2006, and I happened to be on the inside during a very critical time in this recent AI history, when Google was growing from a very successful internet company into a global surveillance monopoly. And that global surveillance monopoly, the infrastructures and the resources that accrue to these large tech companies are the ingredients that are required to create AI today. So I can turn that around a little bit and say that the AI we're talking about when we talk about generative AI, when we talk about these large-scale models, is constituted via concentrated power, and particularly via the concentrated power that has accrued to a handful of actors care of the surveillance business model. So if we want to address the harms of AI, we actually have to go back in time a bit and revive exactly those discourses and critiques of Evgeny Morozov, Shoshana Zuboff, Simone Brown, and others that you mentioned, because the root of the problem is this mass surveillance, is this massive platform network effect, and is the fact that at this point we have a handful of players without many opportunities for meaningful competition on the terms that they set. Now, we can set other terms. We can think about technologies differently. We can think about public service technologies. I think these visions are imperative. But if we're talking about the AI of today, what we're talking about is a derivative of the monopoly surveillance business model. And to address it, we have to address the economic imperatives at the heart of that model.
13 years working with Google and having experienced the concentration of power yourself. Maria, I think my mic.
See, it's loud.
Yeah. It really depends to which corner, to whom of you I talk. So Maria, tell us about your approach, your personal experience with AI and where you come from.
Yeah, so I am the eldest person at this panel. This is my 38th year as a journalist, so I turned 60 last year. I don't mind if you know my age. It's cool. It's good to get older, right? In those 38 years as a journalist, I went from, being able to go somewhere remote and be away for 2 weeks and come out with documentaries and all the stories that you have, to hour by hour, right? It was my team when I was Jakarta Bureau Chief for CNN. We were one of the 12 groups that tested video phone technology, the Toco box, if you remember when it first went live. We tested it and loved it, but as the tech, once we got to the time when I was near leaving CNN after almost 20 years, I would land in a place, so I would get a midnight call and land somewhere, and I would have to be live at the airport and then be live every hour, right? That was satellite technology. So you're only talking 2004 by 2004. And economics is part of it, because satellite technology from my part of the world, I live in the global south, I live in Southeast Asia, from my part of the world, it went from costing $10,000 for a 10-minute satellite window to $400, right? That meant we were live all the time. And that's when you saw the CNN effect. You saw live television. Then it got much worse. I went home in 2005 and I headed the largest network in the Philippines. And part of the reason I went to managing journalists, it's about 1,000 journalists in ABS-CBN, was because I felt that we could do a better job with giving you better stories based on facts. And that's what we'll talk about with standards and ethics. Fact-based, evidence-based, but you spend an entire career as a journalist learning to keep your attention, learning to tell a story that doesn't allow your mind to wander, right? You're lucky in Germany because you still have these documentaries. In fact, Deutsche Welle documentaries are watched by Gen Z in the Philippines. So there is an appetite for this. Hi, Deutsche Welle. But let me echo Meredith. So after I headed the largest news organization, around 2010, we began to see that the internet was going to be the tail that wags the dog on the information ecosystem. I became a journalist because information is power, right? And actually making sure people get the right information, making us live in the same public sphere is the bulwark. Thinking slow is the foundation of both journalism and democracies. When you move to thinking fast, which is anger, fear, hatred, the foundation of how the first contact with AI manipulated us. They hacked our biology because the end goal, they didn't have to spend 38 years learning to tell stories. What they did is they just wanted to keep you scrolling, and they built an outrage economy. So to echo what Meredith said, it is about power and money. And every day that democratic governments do not put in place effective legislation on technology, you carry it. Is there anyone here who doesn't have a cell phone? Right, everyone here has a cell phone. Right? Did you say yes? Did someone here not? We carry this with us. It monitors us, and yet a cup of coffee requires more legislation to be in your hands than this, right? So this is among the least regulated industries globally. And then to take what Meredith said, when it is about power and money, and the foundation is, and this is by design, social media, the first contact with AI really effectively, which let's define AI. It is neither artificial nor is it intelligent, right? It is a marketing term that was created by in an industry that began in 1956, and what you're seeing is just the most recent, it's the most recent one that has gotten the most money. So it is again about power and money. So what happens with this? In 2018, MIT said that lies on social media spread 6 times faster. And in my case, what we learned is what information operations do. Because ultimately, what was created for advertising and marketing did not stay there. Illiberal leaders, authoritarians globally began to use it. Russia was among the first. 2014, we saw the meta-narrative seeded in the information ecosystem. I was lucky enough to be tagged in some of the Twitter things that talked about, that seeded the meta-narrative that allowed Russia to annex Crimea in 2014. And that same meta-narrative is what Putin used to invade Ukraine itself in 2022. Last thing, I know what I'm talking about from the data and from experience, because in 2016, 2016 was when the political dominoes began to fall. Rodrigo Duterte, who brazenly says he killed 3 people. In a 2015 interview I did with him, he told me, yes, I kill people. Do you recognize any others like this? And I was like shocked. I didn't know what to say. But he was elected in 2016. I watched our ecosystem shift, where before we had facts, an algorithm that every social media uses, the Friends of Friends growth algorithm, separated. So if you were pro-Duterte in 2016, the growth of Facebook at that point meant that you moved further right. If you were anti-Duterte, you moved further left. And over time, this chasm grew, right? Let me end quickly with this. In 2016, because Rappler, we created Rappler, there were 3 other women. I don't know why we were all women. It just happened that way, but we're about the same age. But imagine this. The median age in Rappler is 23 years old. So it means we have really young journalists because we know what we don't know. The digital age is different. And then we're 63% women, not by design. Please, we need more men, right? So in 2016, I was pummeled with an average of 90 hate messages per hour. It was brand new, and I had no idea how to handle it. But why the Philippines? Because for 6 years in a row, up until 2021, Filipinos spent the most time online and on social media globally. We were, from the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Chris Wiley, he called us the petri dish where experiments happened. So I used to say in 2016 that what happened to us is coming for you. It is. You're feeling it. Let me just end with this, right? We survived the kind of exponential bottom-up attacks I was getting seeded that journalist equals criminal. There are lots of things that go hand in hand with that. Some people believe it. It's called brigading. Real people began to spread it. This is the way it spreads. We can go into that in more detail. But then, a year later, it was followed by lawfare. And so Rappler in 2017 had 21 investigations. By 2018, my government tried to shut us down in January. Within 4 months, we dropped 49% of our advertising revenue. But it forced us to be more creative, and we found an alternative, sustainable business model. In 2019, I kept getting arrested. I had 10 arrest warrants, kind of back to back. I kept doing a workflow for how to post bail so that I could stay out of jail. The good news, and let me end with this one, is I never lost faith in our justice system, because you have to understand, I learned that fear does wonders to keep people quiet. It's different in every country. In Georgia, for example, right now, they know how to fight back against Russia, because Russia tried to invade in 2008. In the Philippines, we were quiet. And yet, we moved from hell to purgatory. Of the 10 arrest warrants and the criminal charges, I have 2 left. In order to be here in front of you today, I have to ask permission from the Supreme Court. And the 2 cases that are still pending is still a potential shutdown of Rappler. And I could still go to jail for, like it started with 11 cases, with 10 cases, it was more than a century in jail. Today it's only less than a decade, so it gets better. But I guess my last thing I would say is to thank Germany for GDPR, because while you've debated it inside your country, it set the norm. Because when you rolled it out, and I was here in 2018 with Madeleine Albright and a group of Microsoft was there, as was Meta, or before it was called Meta, it was Facebook. It may have had problems in rollout, but it remains the standard for how we can protect ourselves from insidious manipulation. This is not something you see. And when you are pummeled when you say a lie 1 million times, it becomes a fact. And you've heard the president talk about the quotes I say all the time. When you have no facts, without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without these, we have no shared reality. That is what we're fighting. We need to fight for agency, and we need to do it now.
Thank you very much, Maria. You see, we have 2 very brave women here. I think we can say that, very brave. And it's a very important point, I think, also for our debate, that fear is not a good advisor, because then you're paralyzed and you don't get into, the doing. So let's, we have to, you both raised very many important questions, and we try to go into more detail about the future of journalism, about regulation, how to do it, who has to do it, about, saving democracy. But first, I think we have to look into more detail into the question of what is AI? What is behind this term of artificial intelligence? You just said it's neither artificial nor intelligence, so there's obviously something wrong with this term. And Meredith, you once spoke about so-called hyper-oriented debate that we have on AI, and you say there's a mystification, an almost religious myth around artificial intelligence. So let's demystify. What is AI? Is it just a technology? Because, let me just add this, we tried it out yesterday to, Meredith Whittaker AI questions on ChatGPT, and they weren't so bad, you know. It's not, I didn't take them with me, it's my own questions now. But I just want to say, from people like me who don't have a deep technology interest or knowledge, it's sort of a myth. And 2 years ago, it was not possible, you know. Like a computer can sort of think, even though he doesn't have a brain. So please demystify, tell people like me what is behind this artificial intelligence.
Well, that is a very good question, and I trust that ChatGPT didn't create it. I think, you know, there's a lot of ways to approach that question, and I'm going to build on some of the comments that Maria made. The AI we're talking about today, this large-scale data and compute-intensive probabilistic systems, are very good at detecting patterns in large amounts of data and producing determinations, producing predictions, or producing plausibly shaped sentences or images based on the patterns they have encountered in large amounts of data. So again, it's a function of scale of surveillance in the form of data that is either scraped from the web or collected via applications or services or social media platforms. And it's a function of the scale of compute, the sort of increased parallel processing capabilities in chips and compute systems. But the term itself, as Maria noted, is a marketing term. It was created in 1956 by cognitive and computer scientist John McCarthy, and he's very clear about why he coined the term. One, he wanted grant money from the US government, which at that point was funding computational research in service of Cold War dominance, particularly against a nuclear threat from the USSR. And the second reason is understandable to an academic audience. He wanted to be the father of his own field. He didn't want to be a disciple of the current field, which was at that point called cybernetics. So changing the name helped him architect a new field and helped him define the parameters of that field. At no point in its over 70-year-old history has AI referred to a stable set of technological approaches. The actual underlying techniques have varied drastically, but in pursuit of an aspirational goal, which is creating mechanisms that in one way or another seem to mimic human capabilities. So the question then becomes, why did it sprout up like mushrooms in the early 2010s, and why is it such a huge topic of hype and billion-dollar valuations now? And that answer gets back to my first answer, which is the surveillance business model and the commercialization of the internet via the surveillance as the economic engine. Because if you look at the history there, what you see is that the ingredients that were new in the early 2010s when interest in AI began to peak were huge amounts of data and huge amounts of compute. The actual techniques, the algorithms that were being applied to animate these new ingredients dated from the late 1980s. So we have to understand AI today as constituted via that concentrated power, and particularly constituted via the surveillance resources that these companies have. And I think we then need to question, is that something we want to win? Is that something we want to replicate? Is that a foundation, concentrated surveillance power, and the authority to make determinations that comes with it, the authority to create data, the authority to sort and order our world, to define you as worthy of a loan and you as not worthy of a loan, you as getting benefits, you as not getting health insurance, you as a pariah, you as an employed person. Is that something we want to cede to a handful of companies based largely in the US and China who are compelled more by economic imperatives than they are by questions of democracy or the social good, simply based on their structure as shareholder-driven capitalist corporations? So that's the core of AI that I think we need to focus on. And again, that brings us back to GDPR. That brings us back to questions of data privacy, of surveillance, and of platform capitalism that may sound old, but are actually where we should be focusing if we want to focus on remediating the immediate harms that we're facing right now.
Can I quickly jump in and just say
Yes.
that AI, both the older version, right, and generative AI, neither of this technology is actually anchored in facts. Right? Let me say that again. It is not anchored in facts. It is taking data, assigning mathematical values to it, looking for the trends, and then getting enough computational power to be able to find the patterns, and it has parameters, right? So the parameters are to a point where it sounds intelligent, but isn't, right? It isn't anchored in facts. So what does that mean? So the very first time, and Meredith and I were just talking about this before we came on, was it was first, AI was first, or algorithms were used in the prison system. And in that prison system, they used it to figure out who to give bail to, or who should get shorter sentences. And it took a decade before a journalist found that by looking at what the judge's decisions are based on this machine, and then the actual, what happened to the people that it judged on, it showed that they were wrong. The machine was wrong. It was racist, it was biased, and yet people didn't get justice. How do people get justice, right? So that was before, that was like 2010?
2016
right.
was the reporting, but the system had been deployed for about 10 years before then.
So that was like, if you read Weapons of Math Destruction, for example, or you can see some of the ways the tech pushes us forward. But in terms of social media, the generative AI, it's still speculative right now, whether this will actually be able to give you a product you need on a large language model. And let me quickly, I'll toss it back to you on this, but the last part here is, I'm not a tech Luddite. I love tech. Rappler was formed on Facebook, on social media, in 2012. That was when we started it, and we grew very fast. We're the top digital-only news site in the Philippines. If Facebook had better search, I may never have created the website. But the problem we have today is that big tech controls everything. Meredith talked about the surveillance capitalism, surveillance for profit, but think about this, and actually, let me toss it back, because there's so much to bring you about. And sorry, I could talk forever.
No, that's fine. Very interesting points you raised, and I quote you on something else, which is, you said AI is a threat to democracy worldwide. Democracy is on a tipping point worldwide. So I think it's time to talk about more on the question of regulation, because we cannot just ignore that it exists. We live in this world and we have to deal with it. So, Meredith, you said that the different European regulations, that Europe is on a good way. Sometimes in Europe, there's this critique that we are sort of the party poopers, that we do too much regulation that prevents evolution of technologies, that we're behind. Germany is not able to create 5G, even though we are the country of engineers, we used to be. So what do you think about, is this a very strange debate from your point of view, this fear of being over-regulated in this sense, or is there too few regulation, in fact, even in Europe?
Well, regulation is an undefined signifier in some case. There can be very good regulation, which is simply putting guardrails on the market or other social functions. And there can be very bad regulation. And I think that one of the most pernicious mythologies that has been inoculated in the discourse around technology and regulation over the last 20 or 30 years has been the conflation of decisions made by large tech companies and the concept of progress and innovation. These are not the same things. Having another app on my phone that tells me when my laundry is done is not innovative in a way that is driving us toward a livable future. Increasing the energy expenditure by 30%, as Microsoft has done from 2020 until now, in service of building massive data centers that power generative AI systems that are now being shoved into any interface, doing things that are probably not useful to us, increasing surveillance, increasing the clutter, is not innovation in service of a livable future. So I think there is, we should be able to pry these things apart, look at their material reality, look at who is served by this conflation of human progress with technological imperatives in the name of profit, and reject that framing altogether. You can look at the history of internet regulation going back to the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and you see Europe taking an active public service approach at the outset, looking at regulatory frameworks for public media, for public utilities, for other social goods. And you see the US also pushing on Europe to adopt an unmoored free market approach that in 1996 was codified by the Clinton administration, which did two things that have been what I've called the original sins of internet regulation. One, they put no guardrails on surveillance for private companies. So zero privacy regulations, and still in the US we have no federal privacy regulation. So a private company could surveil to an extent and at a depth that governments simply could not anymore. No restrictions. And two, they endorsed advertising as the business model of the internet, pushed by the advertising and marketing industries that didn't want to lose another media ecosystem. They had television, they had print media, they didn't want the internet to go away. And that combination of things, unfettered surveillance and advertising, which is an imperative to surveil, to know your customer, to know your market, created the conditions we have today, and sadly was adopted by Europe as a paradigm which displaced this public service model that is honestly much more appropriate to these naturally monopolistic forms like telephony, like internet, like mass platforms, which survive on the network effect and adhere to the rules of communication networks, in which they are more and more valuable as they grow, as the nodes and people and entities connected to them grow and sustain. So you can't have fragmented networks that don't interconnect with each other that have any value. So again, this is a sort of naturally monopolistic form that for decades had been managed by the state as a state-managed monopoly. And so again, there's a regulatory history here that really throws out this mythologized claim that Europe is somehow standing in the way of progress. And I think we need to ask, progress toward what and at what cost? Progress for whom and at what cost? Because there are winners here, but the winners are a scant handful of men generally based in Northern California, not the whole of society, not democracy, not a healthy information ecosystem.
Very much. The President raised the question on a platform for the EU. So let's talk about this a little bit. And because Maria, you have experience in the Philippines with your own platform. How does this work, and is this model adaptable for Europeans?
Yeah. So first, I guess Meredith and I both have. Let me speak for myself, and because you have to get her views on Signal, but. I believed in big tech. I literally built Rappler, and we grew exponentially because of Facebook. And yet, because I almost went to jail and may still, I know the dangers all too well, and we have the data of the Philippines, and it is replicated in every single country. In November 2022, Dmitry Muratov and I came out with a 10-point action plan that's largely addressed to the EU. It's been signed by more than 300 Nobel laureates, civil societies. There are several German NGOs that have signed on to it. It goes down to 3 buckets, the same call Meredith has done. The first is stop surveillance for profit. The second is stop coded bias. Because if you are a woman LGBTQ+, if you are brown or black or live in the global south, the bias is coded in. It isn't one editor that is just editing a story and makes a mistake. It is an algorithm or a machine choice that will replicate it tens of millions of times. So gendered disinformation, for example, we just finished a report on Moldova and the attacks against the women president, Maria Sandu, right? In Brazil and the attacks on women, in the Philippines and the attacks on women. That I know very well. In the United States and ground zero on Hillary Clinton. The third is journalism as an antidote to tyranny. A machine is not going to question power. A machine will give you, Meredith said it, it's a probabilistic machine. So it will give you, depends on garbage in, garbage out. All of these foundational models, there are 10 of them that were ranked by Stanford at the beginning of last year, they all failed in terms of transparency of the training data that went in. But if they used social media, which pushes lies, incites fear, anger, and hate, then that is in your training model as well, right? So let me just say, and let me answer your question now. So after all of this, it's been 8 years since 2016. And I have begged tech companies, I have asked them to have enlightened self-interest. Who wants to kill democracy, right? Because if you do not have facts, if you, the voter, are being manipulated, it doesn't matter if the infrastructure for voting is good and has integrity, but the voters' emotions have been manipulated and they've been pounded by information warfare, right? We have to a degree already lost agency, and I'll point you towards many studies that have been done, including most recently the Surgeon General of the United States did a report on teenagers, increased incidence of sleeplessness, depression, suicides. If you're a young woman on Instagram, you have greater incidence of eating disorder, of being sexualized, right? I mean, I can do a litany. But having said that, so let me go back to answer your question. So last year, and this is for everyone globally, digital news, if we follow the same trend today, will die within 6 to 8 months, right? Why? Because there are only 3 ways a website gets traffic: direct, social, or search. The world's largest distributor of news is Facebook. And yet, starting in January 2023, as a policy, which they've now admitted, Facebook began choking traffic to news. It could be because they were preparing for 2024, the year of elections, but every news site lost between 50% to 85% of traffic from the largest distributor of news, 50 to 85%. The second one, search, right? So we switched to search once I was getting attacked on social media. 60%, up to 60% of Rappler's traffic comes from search. And yet last year, around March, Google said, we're going to use generative AI for search. And they called it Search Generative Experience. They began experimenting with it. They built the generative AI on top of search. So they said, you can opt out as a news site if you don't want our machine to eat up all your content that you spent a lot of money on. But if you do, you disappear from search, right? That's 60% of our traffic in Rappler. So we didn't. We stayed on, and just May this year, it's been rolled out publicly in the United States. So what does that mean? It means news websites will probably get 30% minimum less traffic. And beginning January this year, journalists have been laid off by the thousands. So we're surviving. The business model must move to data and tech. And long answer to your question, but we began building tech last year. We pivoted our switch from building our own and built a Matrix protocol chat app. It's a separate, there's a Signal protocol, but the Matrix protocol is where Germany's websites are on the Matrix protocol. France's websites are on the Matrix protocol. And it allows us, we rolled it out very quietly last December, Journalists building tech is very simple. It's 10 points of how we moderate the content and if we don't insidiously manipulate you. And the goal here is initially first, because I'm preparing for my presidential elections in 2025, midterm elections in 2025 and the presidential elections post. Bring our people to a safe place online where they will not be manipulated because it is end-to-end encrypted and it is decentralized. That sounds, here's what you need to take out. The danger is that you'll find it boring, right? And let me tell you about the way you consume news, right? In general, even when I was managing the largest news organization, in it's the largest broadcasting network in the Philippines, news was only 20% of the, you know this, Germany, right? Because you make more money from entertainment. It's always about power and money. And so I always used to fight for that 20%. And here's the way we watch. During normal times, when you watch news ratings will go down. In the Philippines and other countries where law and order is weak, our news tends to have higher ratings than yours, where you have predictability and rule of law. But when breaking news happens, when a disaster strikes, when typhoons, we have an average of 20 typhoons every year. We are at the forefront of climate change issues, right? When these happen, that goes up to 100%. And that is something tech guys, engineers just don't get, right? Like you should not be determining the public information ecosystem based on this moment when nothing is happening and people don't care about information integrity. People die. There was genocide in Myanmar because of these platforms, right? So we're building our own. It's rolled out. It is, I wish I didn't have to, but we also can't survive. So we federate news, and I'm absolutely certain that you will need us.
As a model. Very interesting. It's actually
us as in journalism.
It's interesting what you say, and it's, I think, an experience that most journalists have made, that if you look at the articles and the click numbers, it's not the most interesting and not the articles you invested the most time in, but it's the one where you start with a joke or where there's a picture with some little cat playing or something. So, it's just as it works.
News. The tech guys commodified it and made it less than what it is.
We will talk about the future of journalism maybe later with the public, because what you said, if I got you right, that it constitutes a genuine threat to journalism. If I get you right, it's dead within the next 6 to 8 months. So I'm a little worried myself. But Meredith, before we open up, one question to you, because we're trying to find pathways out. We're trying to define ways of, living in a modern tech world and at the same time safeguarding our democracy. You are the president of Signal. So this is, if I got you right, this is, one way to combine these two goals. What is your experience? How does it work? Because it's one of the only messaging tools that are non-profit.
Yeah, it is the largest truly private messaging service in the world. So we're in an interesting space because we are competing, in a sense, with the big guys on their terms, in terms of scale, in terms of many features, in terms of look and feel, insofar as that's possible, in an encrypted environment, which gets into some technical rabbit holes. And at the same time, we're rejecting that business model. And we're rejecting that business model. We have become a nonprofit, because surveillance is at the heart of the economy of Silicon Valley. So we didn't feel that it was safe to try to do both, to try to prioritize profit structurally while focusing our mission solely on preserving the human right to private communications in the digital realm. And now we were very lucky in some sense. Moxie Marlinspike, who is the founder, began developing Signal in the late 2000s. So Signal came up at a time when the market was not saturated by big tech, when WhatsApp didn't exist yet, when the competition was web-based clients and not mobile phones. The iPhone was introduced around the same time Signal started being developed. So Signal was able to garner a very strong reputation in the technical community by publishing our code in the open, by having that scrutinized by many people through that community immune system. And it was able, very critically, to generate a network effect of people who use Signal around the globe. Many, many millions of people. It's been downloaded over 2 million times on the Play Store alone. 200 million, sorry. Much, much more than 2 million. Which means that it's useful for others. If I pick up a chat app and none of my friends use it, I can't use it, right? It's not an ideological choice. It's a choice that has to be made in community. So we are very dedicated to continuing to build and maintain Signal because we don't think you could simply introduce a new player into the market successfully, given the monopoly conditions we're working under right now. And we are committed to setting the high watermark in tech for privacy. In other words, showing that it can be done differently, rewriting parts of the stack to enable privacy in a context where the norm, where the common libraries that are used and other technical infrastructures assume your desire is to collect and create as much data as possible and monetize that for surveillance in one way or another. So this is where the Signal effort and Signal as the gold standard in private tech is actually very relevant to this AI discussion. Because again, AI is based, it's built, it's a derivative of this surveillance business model. It requires huge amounts of data and it calls into being more data when it produces a determination, when it produces a weird, non-factual but plausible looking sentence structure. It is creating more data that then gets back into the ecosystem that can have power over you even if it's not correct, right? So creating tech that can actually interrupt and reject that model is just as important, in my view, as legislation, regulation, and other measures to check that business model and to deconstruct it. So we do have to build public interest infrastructure. And I'll end on this point, which I hope is catalytic for change and hope and not depressing. Because we are dealing with very somber topics, and so we have to be able to both look them in the face clearly and accept what we're seeing, and not have that lead to despair and inaction. We're in a bit of an interregnum right now, geopolitically. We're looking at an election in the US that could go in any number of ways, but it is likely that Trump will be elected, looking at the landscape. And part of the 2025 project is very clear. This is the 2025 project, for those of you not familiar, is a sort of speculative transition plan that lays out sort of, the architecture and first steps of a potential Trump administration. And one of the items in there is a move that would place the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission under direct presidential control, under the executive branch. And of course, these are the most powerful tech regulators in the US. They regulate spectrum auctions, they regulate technology companies and competition. And so you're looking at a scenario in which both the cloud infrastructure, on which most of the world's digital technology runs, so German startups, French startups, startups in the Philippines will probably run on AWS, Google Cloud, or Azure, as will government infrastructures, as will other civic infrastructures, because the 3 US cloud companies have 70% of the market, where the digital infrastructure and, echoing Maria's points, the information ecosystem, 4 of the 5 dominant platforms, which is the way we access the news, either through search or social media platforms, will be jurisdictioned in the US under potentially that kind of direct presidential control in an environment where we know from history that these companies routinely break their promises of civic good in favor of profit and growth and proximity to power. So I lay out that landscape not to paralyze us, but to make it clear that it's not simply a nice fantasy, that we can tinker with in service of having a feel-good project for social change, but an absolute imperative that Europe and the rest of the world begin developing an alternative technological ecosystem that, one, does not mirror the monopoly surveillance business model. We're not trying to create that but here. And two, that takes seriously what could happen if those mass surveillance infrastructures are weaponized by an authoritarian regime. And I think we do have tools to do that. We have models like Signal. We have alternative journalism models. We have many templates that date from the 70s, 80s, and 90s where people were thinking through these architectures before those were foreclosed by a number of neoliberal choices. But nonetheless, that needs to be a focal point in order for us to, I believe, safeguard and shore up democratic and social institutions at a time where we're going to be facing many other very challenging efforts, from climate to the future of journalism and democracy.
Can I add like the three things
yeah.
for her?
Okay, very short,
and
because
I
we want to open up, we want to give the public the possibility.
I think the first is just that this is called deliberative technology, and Meredith pointed out it was in 1996 in the United States, that 1996 Communications Decency Act, which gave the tech companies impunity, essentially, right? So that is part of the problem, but deliberative technology gives you back your agency. It is more boring, but you will get facts, right? Who said that we need to get tens of millions, that we need to get a fire hose of crap, sorry. And then the other part is also that you can think and that you can participate in the conversation, deliberative technology. And on Signals and human rights activists, right? Sorry, the second point we didn't make is that there's a direct link between the integrity of information and the fact that 71% of the world today is under illiberal, under authoritarian rule. That's a VDEM. And 2024, you referenced, I started saying this, 2020, during the pandemic maybe, that 2024 was a tipping point year. You have elections coming up. You kind of know where it's headed. And information warfare is hitting at every point. So how do we deal with this? I think this is one of the solutions.
Thank you very much, Maria. I think it's very important for the European debate, this very clear call for European sovereignty in this point, and then at least in Germany, we focus very much on the danger coming from China. This is something we discuss here, but so you gave us a broader view on the different dangers coming from, even if Trump is not elected, but then a lot worse. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Maria, for your insights. And now I'd like to open up. You can either raise your question, your comment in English. Sie können es auch auf Deutsch gerne machen. Wir haben Übersetzung. Mr. President, do you want to start? Do you have observations on our talk?
Ja, ich habe 100 Fragen.
Hundreds of questions, actually.
Ich will nur zwei kleine.
But I just wanted to mention two of them. Maria, one to you. I absolutely share your point of view, how important quality journalism is. And for Germany, I keep repeating that quality journalism has to remain distinguishable from social media, from other platforms, to remain viable, to survive, to be based on facts and reason. And when we talk about social media and AI, we also talk about economics and financial viability, and that also applies to quality journalism. So I would ask you, what do you think, competing with these actors, and the consumers are moving more towards social media and using social media, do we need different ways to ensure that quality journalism remains viable? What would you suggest? And another question, Ms. Whittaker, I think you once said that you're not a techie, and that's why you talk about when you talk about AI, you talk about it in a different way than a techie might do. But still, I think the question remains, when we talk about European sovereignty,
dann geht das ja wahrscheinlich nicht ohne
that probably won't be possible without being on a level playing field at the same level technologically as other models, as competitors. So we have to have the same technical expertise. I mean, you can think about regulation, of course, but we'd fail with regulation if we don't have the necessary technical expertise, I think. And that's why I mentioned earlier during my speech that irrespective of what we do in terms of regulation, we have to invest more in development, technical development, research and development, in the speed of translating basic research into applications in Europe, and more so than we've done in the past. So would you agree?
President, before you react to this, we have, and I'm very happy to see that we have 8 people who want to make a comment, who have a question. So please be a little brief so we can...
TV sound bites you want,
so
right?
we can, talk to a lot of people, because we have about only 15, 20 minutes left, even if we go over the time a little bit. So you want to start, Maria?
Yeah, I'll start, sir, with in 2019, we began to create kind of, because we could see that the dam was about to fall on news, right? And I think part of the problem is that the heads of news organizations, especially the large ones, we still think we have power. You know, when generative AI came out, the WGA, the Writers Guild Association, all came together and collectively worked together to carve out their rights. That never happened with news. And we're each individually trying to negotiate with the very same. It's almost like the robber barons of the industrial age is what I would compare them to. So what did we do? We created something called the International Fund for Public Interest Media. And when I say we, not Little Rappler, but Mark Thompson, who was New York Times, and before he became the head of CNN, and I co-chair the IFPIM, the International Fund for Public Interest Media. I believe Germany is one of the funders for this. It is looking at the overseas development assistance funds of democratic nations, noting that they're only spending 0.3% to help independent media survive, and we are pushing to kick that up to maybe 1%. That would be $1 trillion if we hit 1%, right? But last year we raised $50 million, and that is now being given as an interim. Like, this is literally just kind of, it's like putting bandage on it, right? So you don't bleed out. It's putting pressure on it, but it's not enough. And we must develop a new business model because, and why does this go hand in hand with legislation? Isn't it against the law? I mean, look, I went to the Pope. Pope Francis calls 30 Nobel laureates to talk about AI, right? Like, well, that wasn't his topic, but it became mine. And he has a great advisor on it. Part of the 10 Commandments is, thou shalt not lie. So I went to the Pope and said, you know, lies spread 6 times faster on social media. The incentive structure of our communications ecosystem literally brings out the worst of humanity. That turns everything upside down. That plays to the favor of illiberal leaders. So the longer term, we need to find more solutions, but if the laws come in place, right, I think about it as a river, polluted river. Instead of trying to do content moderation and pick up the water, clean it up with a pill, and then throw it back in, let's go up to the factory of lies and shut it down.
Thank you very much. Meredith, the question regarding European sovereignty, European capability to tech. What is your view?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think this is actually a very exciting opportunity for nurturing meaningful research and technical capabilities, but research and capabilities that aren't focused on the question of how do we build an even better and even bigger model using even more data that we may have scraped or collected illegally that requires environmentally harmful infrastructure that is only owned by a handful of companies to run. There are many, many different ways to collect and create data, in a more democratic and socially governed fashion to decide what do we want to know about our world, what types of methodologies do we create to accurately produce data that we can claim to be a real representation of a complex reality. Okay, we have that data. How do we use that data? How do we detect patterns across that data that tell us more about ourselves and our world so we can act on that democratically? What governance structures need to be in place there? And then how do we build models with that data that may help us move forward with that governance? So those are all questions that right now are not really being incentivized or asked in what we're calling technical research. There is a huge rush to focus only on these large-scale models that constitutively require researchers to partner with a handful of large tech firms to get access to computational infrastructure and data. So there's a capture of both the field of research in computer science, and particularly AI, and of what the definition of quality research is to begin with. So I think what Europe and Germany can do is, one, reject that very, very narrow and self-interested definition and begin incentivizing research questions that actually lead to more sovereign technology, that actually undo some of these harms, instead of trying to replicate a monopoly form based on mass data surveillance. Here, not there, trying to think about how do we build tech in a different paradigm? How do we build more open tech? How do we incentivize civic governance? How do we think about data construction outside of allowing a company to simply define our world based on data they create and collect but won't share? How do we do that ourselves? And so there is a host of unanswered questions and brilliant minds who can tackle those. But it takes the bravery to challenge that paradigm and not allow a handful of companies to define what we mean by technology and define what we mean as worthwhile research.
Tech for the common good. Thank you. I propose that we combine two questions now. Is that okay for you?
Sure.
So Alena Büchs and then Manuel Hartung, please. We have the microphone coming down.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was fascinating and deeply depressing.
Yeah.
My name is Alena Büchs. I'm an ethicist, and I just came out of my tenure as chair of the German Ethics Council. We put out a big report on the ethics of AI. So first of all, Meredith, I want to thank you for asking the major ethical question, what is it actually good for? Because I think we don't ask that enough. Thank you for that very much. My question is, and you can't be surprised, possibly both of you, but mainly to Meredith. In our report, we also said we need an alternative. We were talking about social media, a critical digital infrastructure for our public discourse, and we were accused, like many others in 2022, of being incredibly naive. And I think we're no longer accused of that. But the picture that you have painted, which is incredibly dark, makes everybody think, I guess, we need to divest as quickly as possible. And as you also know, all the sort of obvious alternatives, the Fediverse and all of these things, Mastodon, Blue Sky and so on, haven't really gotten off the ground. And I want to confront you with a very radical proposal that is not from the Ethics Council, but actually came from industry leaders behind closed doors who said to me, you know what, the combination of GDPR and the AI Act will sort out the bias issue, will probably put some limits on the surveillance stuff. And I actually agree. I think the regulation is much better than its reputation and it won't stifle innovation. But at this point, isn't this a trust problem? Or rather an antitrust problem? Do we need a new Sherman Act? Do we need global antitrust regulation? Because the market power, the monopolies that we see, will not be broken up by European regulation sort of reining in the biggest risks. Is there something to that, and do you see any way of doing that?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Maybe we go to Manuel Hartung. Is that okay? And then we answer them together. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that interesting and, as Alena Büchs said, depressing talk at the same time. I'm Manuel Hartung. I'm with the Signal Foundation. And since the headline of that discussion is, do we need a new Enlightenment? I want to ask you on the role of education. So the federal president touched in his speech upon your notion, Maria, that the long-term key to solve many of those problems would be education. So there are a couple of initiatives and foundations in this room that target education and that go into schools and do fascinating work there, that go to universities and try to do work there, but those are all institutions where many people have to go to. So what I would ask you is, how can we reach those people that do not go to school anymore? How do we reach those people that are kind of lost or disconnected from discourses for a long time? There is a German scientist, Bernhard Pörksen, who developed the idea of the editorial society, redaktionelle Gesellschaft, where every single one of us has to be a journalist as a part of general knowledge. So how could we reach, in your opinion, this utopia of an editorial society where everyone can be a journalist, and how can we reach those people who might be disconnected?
Thank you, Manuel. So Meredith, please, to the question of Alina Büchs.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. I think the short answer is yes, we absolutely need structural separation and other so-called antitrust measures. That is very clear, and I think that's a place to start, both building what is the alternative to the vertically integrated surveillance monopolies that we have today. And I would say absolutely the AI Act and GDPR are powerful pieces of regulation. The issue that I see is what's on paper in GDPR in particular versus what's enforced are vastly different. So GDPR would easily support a ban on surveillance advertising. That's a conservative reading of the bill. We see almost no enforcement of that. So I think political will becomes the variable we need to talk about in the context of an industry that's spending $500 million on lobbying last year, that is swarming Brussels, swarming DC, buying up the most expensive townhouses on Embassy Row, hosting cocktail hours multiple times a day, right? This is an industry that is intent on influencing policymaking and directing political will toward their end. So there is a movement, as Mr. President said, that is going to be required to make it more costly not to enforce, not to act, than it is to act. And right now it is more costly to act because all of the pressure, or so much of the pressure, is coming from industry, and we are working with a very hollowed out civil society that doesn't have the funding it needs, that doesn't have the support it needs, and a university ecosystem where big tech increasingly in the US is a primary funder of an academic system where the social wage and state support has been withdrawn and big donors make up an increasing part of the revenue stream to the university business model.
Increasingly, you are seeing the illiberal leaders and tech using the same tactics. So I say that because I've seen it in my country. We're looking at Chinese information operations and how it has worked in the last few things. But to answer your question,
On education, maybe.
well, first on this one, GDPR, like, I know we're running out of time, so I will do it quickly, right? Because there's three things. I think the first is, please understand that this is like fighting the robber barons when the age of industrialization happened and all the laws came out after, and the robber barons were so guilty they then funded education in the United States, right? If you remember, this is Carnegie, this is Rockefeller, this is all of this stuff, except now add in tobacco and climate, hand in hand with exponential damage, right? So Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chair, former head of the Soviet Union, said that disinformatia is like cocaine. You take it once or twice, you're okay. But if you take it all the time, you become an addict, a changed person. We have been taking it all the time. We are addicts. And that is part of the reason you're seeing the shift to illiberal. I mean, we are electing illiberal leaders democratically, right? That is the corruption of our information ecosystem. Let me answer quickly, there's so much to say about it, but the role of education is that it is still a medium term, and the problem right now is it goes hand in hand with the law. Because if you do not stop it, you will lose a generation. Right now, if you look at the United States, we've literally looked at 7 layers of manipulation that is setting the stage for the US presidential elections. And I can go over this in more detail post, but I have tweeted, so I hate to bring you to X. I would bring you to Signal if you were on Signal, but we are. Of the 7 layers of manipulation, there is a wide generation gap on every single issue, and we took down 2 years of data on abortion, immigration, and Gaza. And the gap in generation goes hand in hand, not just with the idealism of youth, but the fact that youth is targeted more, they believe more in social media. They get their news on social media.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'm sorry, we have several guests who have to leave on time, so I have to close the discussion now. I know that there are many more questions and remarks, but there will be time to discuss because the President, or you want to ask your question now? Oh, sorry, I got you wrong. I thought because you said you wanted to. Okay, so I look at the organizers, do we have a couple of more minutes? Okay, thank you. So, sorry, I got this time wrong.
Else.
Please, Andrea Nahles.
My name is Andrea Nahles. I'm the head of the Federal Agency for Employment, the biggest public sector in Germany, in all of Europe, with 113,000 employees. And I believe that with all that we heard here, there is something we can get back to. Let's look at what we can do in Europe. We have a strong public sector. It's the source of boredom. We have data in the public sector, and not few, if I may say so. We have data. We can decide on how we want to deal with these data. And this is something that brings me to say we talked about, we joined forces with the pension insurance and accident insurance, and we looked at data. How do we deal with cloud? And it all depends on the outcome of the elections in the US. But from my point of view, the question arises, what strategies can we use as a source to gain sovereignty? And my second point I want to make, yes, we can regulate. Yes, we have the AI Act in Europe. I had an ambivalent feeling. I was afraid that they would exclude the public sector from AI. We want to be able to work with our clients in a modern fashion. No, we were not excluded, thank God, but so we have a regulatory framework in which we can act, and we're protected, and we can think about what to do with these data to support good journalism, fact, and remain a source of facts and truth. And we will only succeed if we manage to regulate ourselves. What's the power of self-regulation in this context? We actually have an initiative, human-friendly automation, together with Audi, the pension scheme, to give us an ethical code and to look at how do we want to deal with, how do we get our employees on board? What do we do? What don't we do? And by way of self-regulation, we try to create a sphere, to open a sphere that actually is free of manipulative lobbyism, and decide the context within which we want to operate in. After listening to you, Mrs. Whittaker, I'm in doubt whether we did all this in vain. I asked myself, what is it worth? Is it going to add added value? But in the context of AI Act and self-regulation and the power that we still have in the public sector to use it intelligently, maybe we can achieve something. So my question is, what kind of impact does self-regulation have?
I think I'm hesitating because in the US discourse I'm familiar with, self-regulation often refers to companies, to the fox regulating the henhouse, to use a metaphor, to companies regulating themselves without, so I hear what you're describing to be more almost creative innovation to build technology or implement different technological systems in ways that promote German sovereignty or help citizenry. And I think there are many approaches there. And in fact, I think we need to look at those efforts as the seeds that we can grow in order to combat the potential harms of a weaponized, concentrated information ecosystem in the US. I would look at efforts like the Sovereign Tech Fund that is resourcing some of the core infrastructures on which networks rely and that are often in disrepair because they've been maintained by volunteers for a long time. And that is a German government-funded effort that has a lot of positive direction. I would look at some of the data governance structures that have been put in place in Barcelona with people like Francesca Bria and others working on civic governance as a template that we can expand there. I would again look at efforts like Signal that show that it can be done, that actually we're not lacking for ideas and initiatives and brilliant directions to move in. We're lacking in capital. We're lacking in real resources. And when I say real resources, I want to note that Amazon spent $53 billion on data center improvements and build-outs in the Pacific Northwest of the US in 1 quarter alone. And yeah, that's a lot of money, but that's the kind of money that states can marshal. That's the kind of money that sovereign wealth can marshal. That's the kind of money we actually need to be talking about if what we're looking at is building a livable technological future in a way that can ensure we tackle climate, in a way that can ensure we tackle information ecosystem collapse, in a way that can meet the many other challenges that are facing us one way or another in the future.
So let me say the good stuff, right? The good stuff.
Vielleicht darf ich die positiven Punkte hervorheben. Wo funktioniert das? Und ich hoffe, dass das bei Ihnen funktioniert. Die positiven Aspekte liegen in der Medizin, in der synthetischen Biologie. Es liegt darin, die Daten zu nutzen, die man hat. Ich war 3 Jahre im Vorstand einer Versicherungsagentur, AXA. Und da ging es darum, die richtige Technologie zu finden, die Daten zu nutzen und die Menschen und das Unternehmen zu schützen. Um herauszufinden, wie man sich verbessern kann. Die Krankenhäuser, die synthetische Biologie, wir sehen die gezielte Nutzung. Die Grundlagenmodelle können funktionieren. Die Radiologie zum Beispiel, die Dinge, die noch überprüft werden von Menschen. Aber was nicht funktionieren wird, ist das Thema Information, die nicht auf Fakten basiert. Da kommt es ja zu Manipulationen. Und was noch damit einhergeht, ist Folgendes. Das Geld fließt dahin. Warum ist da so ein...
to keep doing it. So will we continue? To the journalists in the audience, will you continue the hype? Or will you ask tougher questions, the same questions we ask of illiberal leaders?
I want, on this money point, just I apologize.
Sorry.
I know we're really dragging this out, but we're estimating about $1 billion for one training run of the latest GPT model.
And it hasn't been proven that it works.
Training runs usually happen 1 or 2 times, and that's not counting the labor, that's not counting the cost of using the model, which is much more computationally and resource intensive than an average information retrieval request. So what we are seeing in part is a desperate hype cycle that needs a return on investment. And this is why we're seeing AI in everything, annoying prompts. We can't open WhatsApp without some AI bot that's telling us something we don't need, that's taking up valuable resources. And we are seeing also really dangerous failure modes, like Microsoft almost introducing something called Recall that would ship with their latest Windows operating systems that was designed to be an AI that remembered everything you did on your computer, like we need to know that, but required as the basis for this AI, screenshots of every 5 seconds of you using your device that it could query to answer your questions, creating an incredibly dangerous honeypot. And again, what I read there is the fact that they are so desperate to return on investment, to keep this market inflated, to find a market fit where there quite hasn't been one for these expensive technologies, that they are willing to subvert their security practices, that they are willing to rush something to market with AI promises and mythologized AI marketing, even when it poses such a clear danger and such little real utility to the people who would use it.
Thank you, Meredith. Do we have time for 2 more questions, or should we? Yes? Okay. Then we have you and you.
Okay, thank you. I shorten it and I just do a comment. First of all, thank you very much, Maria, for the commercial break for Deutsche Welle. So,
hi, nice
highly
to see
appreciate
you.
it. And secondly, I think Mr. President is absolutely right. We need some European infrastructure on a public service model, but it will take a lot of time. And as you said, Maria, we don't have time. So I think we all have to be sure that we have to go into heavy regulation for these platforms. If we don't regulate them and don't force them to privilege fact-based and evidence-based journalism, we will lose the battle. We will lose the battle constantly against the Russians, because we also have to force them to do this in Russian. We have to do this in every language spoken in the European Union. So I can really ask the politics to be much stronger on this idea. Thank you.
Over here, please.
Full transparency, Rappler is a partner of Deutsche Welle, but that wasn't why I said that. Sorry. We're just starting the partnership now. Which, by the way, the tech companies aren't that transparent, right?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I'm one of these manipulative lobbyists from the big tech industry.
Fantastic.
Jennifer Perno, and I'm from Microsoft. And so when we talk about new technologies, about AI, etc., yes, we need regulation. Yes, we welcome the EU AI Act because we need these guardrails you were talking about. But my question is, of course we can, each of us, think about regulation in our own home countries, but where do you see this discussion going globally? Do you think we can achieve having some kind of governance globally, or is this rather naive when you think about especially authoritarian regimes?
Can I take this one?
Yeah, you can both take it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm the vice chair of the Internet Governance Forum of the UN, and originally the infrastructure of the Internet was collectively managed by 125 to 150 different regional groups that rolled into the Internet Governance Forum, and then the private companies took them on, right? Now, the most interesting part, so the chair of this is Vint Cerf, Google. I'm the vice chair. We fight all the time in a very nice way, and we somehow find solutions. Government agents are there. There needs to be, I think I would say Microsoft comes into this at a different level, right? Because you don't have social media, but you have different goals with this. So
LinkedIn.
Oh, yes, Bing.
HoloLens.
Okay.
Bing.
So Meredith can tackle that. But what I would say is that it must be global. Because if it isn't, you know, what Germany did with GDPR cascaded to the Philippines, cascaded to the global south. It takes far more for the companies to have one-on-one, and they're starting to do that now, and that will mean even worse things, I think. Enlightened self-interest on the company's end, right? Truly, you do not want democracy to die. You do not want the next generation to not be able to find meaning.
Well, I think it would be nice if it were global, but I think in an environment where we have so little mechanism for governing such a global structure democratically right now, we would see what has happened to the standards bodies and internet governance efforts overall, which is they are effectively colonized by the large companies who can pay people to attend to them, to read the message boards, to show up at the meetings across the globe yearly. And unless we actually put resources behind that, we're not going to see a global system that doesn't replicate the localized systems that we have now.
Thank you, Meredith. We have one more last question. Thank you.
Ja, ich freue mich, dass ich die letzte Frage haben darf.
Well, I'm delighted to be asking the last question. Gabi Petri, I'm a head teacher at an educational college, and I think, reflecting what young people probably want, people that are very enthusiastic about social media and technology. And if I think of them, then we have a school that is very digital. We've got awards for the digital resources that we're using. We're a very political school. We're using ChatGPT in class, different AI models that we're using, and we talk about its use. And we point out the risks. We have certain rules how these models are supposed to be used in class, but we are in the educational system, in schools, we're facing a dilemma because the world of students happens on TikTok, on social media, it happens on Instagram, and that's where they live, where they spend their time. And for us as schools, we can't really help but enter that world that they live in. So I think what they keep reporting as feedback is where are you in those worlds? You don't really happen in our lives as schools, as educational institutions. That's the discussions that we're having in class as well. And I mean, knowing all the risks and being aware of that, we can't really close our eyes to this reality in this world. So I'm still, despite all of this, I'm still on Instagram because I want to communicate with my students. I want to be able to reach young people. So that's kind of what I have to do. I mean, what else can we do? Despite these ethical issues and being faced with reality, actual reality, how can we bridge that gap?
Regulation then.
Yeah.
I mean, I think most parents know this from home, struggling with this form of regulation, telling your kids what to do and where are the barriers. So who wants to reply to this very important question?
I have a quick response,
Go.
and I'll hand it to Maria. I think there's nothing better calibrated to completely lose credibility with young people or anyone else than to insist on a reality that doesn't exist, to enforce some paradigm that doesn't match their experiences. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn for the recruiters, I'm on Gmail because it's the enterprise suite that we're able to use. This isn't, I think, a matter of individual puritanism. The problem we're facing is that the information environments and the communication systems, minus Signal, that we now rely on have been colonized by these businesses. That other forms and other modes and other publics that could have been are foreclosed because what we have now is a pleasing app that scrolls you through videos and we can all get a little serotonin from that or outrage, but it has displaced other realities we might want to replace. So I think it is, the idea that this is an individual choice and that students can be conscripted to some sort of Calvinist purity where they're no longer participating in the world is silly and actually insulting to the human beings who are young and experiencing this world. I think it's engaging it with them. What are we seeing? Where is the actual power lie? Who's making money when you scroll through those videos and feel more and more and more depressed? Taking a critical eye and walking them through this so they start contributing to the ideation process of how do we change this? What do we actually want? Hey, what's happening when I feel so bad when I'm going through those videos?
and how do I have a reflexive muscle that can actually reflect on this and conscript myself and my peers as part of the solution. So it's not denialism. It's a constructive view on what's actually happening, and that, you know, cleaning the lens so we see it clearly and thus can address it in ways that are meaningful.
But I think we need to do what Peter said, which is to actually literally regulate already, right? So Rappler is a partner of every single major tech company. We were one of 10 groups that OpenAI chose to test their LLM on democratic consultation, and we did in the Philippines, and we found ways to make it work, right? We are a Facebook. We were essentially the first partners. We pointed out the flaws. We showed them what was wrong, and they've taken down certain things. This has been a long time. We cannot turn away from the tech because it is there. It has changed us. And my biggest concern with with Gen Z is that they're growing up in an environment where they cannot trust anything. Right? So how do they find meaning? And maybe what Meredith just said, which is the teachers go through it with them. But look at what is happening, right? It's literally, we are paying for the years and years that we have become addicts to the tech, which means governments, please regulate. In the Nobel lecture in 2021, I asked for an end to Section 230 in the United States. My lawyer said, don't include that. I never really followed the advice of my lawyers, so they get mad at me. But I did say, reform or revoke Section 230. We already have laws in place for publishers. These guys are not pipelines. They literally decide what you get in your feed. They are publishers. Why are they not held to the same rules?
Good question. We discussed this further, I think. Thank you so much. We should...
Sorry.
Next time we should take a couple of hours more. We could have, but I just want to say one more sentence before I hand over to the president. I think, you know, yes, I also had this feeling, as Alina Bück said, of this is so depressing, this is so dark. But then I think, and I just want to stress this at the end, that there are ways out. That it just says Zusammenhalt und Aufbruch, which is, you know, sticking together and set off departure, you know, take off. Like we could do something together, I think. And I think it's good to hear all these very critical voices and then think of what is European sovereignty all about? Can't we build in this continent with so many great ideas, so many good technicians, something else, not being dependent and not destroying our democracy? And I think we figured out some pathways to do it, and this makes me in the end still somehow optimistic. And I'm also optimistic to continue this debate after the president invited us.
Jetzt weiß ich, was ich zu tun habe.
Yeah, that seems to be my job. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are a bit running a bit behind schedule, but it's not the end of our discussion and debate. It's the very beginning, rather, and that is why we're not trying to summarize everything that's been said. So we're just shifting the discussion into the adjoining rooms, and our experts are going to be joining us as well for further discussions. And I'm left with thanking you for joining us here today, for your contributions, and a round of applause for Ms. Ressa, Ms. Whittaker, and of course Ms. Rubowski. Thank you so much.
Und am einfachsten ist es, wenn
And I
Sie mir
think
jetzt einfach folgen.
just follow me. I think that's going to be the fastest. Just tag along.